You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. In the previous episode, we started diving into a really interesting new book called The Period Brain. And today, we're going to dig even deeper into it. I found this book to be so fascinating and I learned a ton from it, so we have a lot more to discuss. We're going to start by talking about something that a lot of people don't realize, which is that women's metabolic needs actually change throughout the menstrual cycle, such that their bodies actually need more calories when they're in the luteal phase, which follows ovulation. Why is this important? Well, most of the dietary advice we get in society is one size fits all, and it tells us that we're supposed to consistently take in the same number of calories each day. But the number you need actually depends on where you are in the cycle. And this is really the problem with so much of the one-size-fits-all medical advice that's out there. It doesn't really account for women's unique experiences. And this is a symptom of a much bigger problem, which is the lack of representation of women in scientific studies. So much of our health knowledge is based on studies that only included men, because for a long time it was thought that male and female bodies are interchangeable, but they aren't. Also, a lot of scientists simply haven't bothered to include female participants because they're seen as quote-unquote too complicated because the researchers don't know how to account for hormone fluctuations during the menstrual cycle. So when they do include women, they often only include women who are in the same phase of the menstrual cycle, which isn't going to give a complete picture of women's experiences. So in today's show, we're going to talk about why scientists need to stop ignoring the menstrual cycle and how we can improve the state of science on women's health and well-being. I am joined once again by Dr. Sarah Hill. She is author of This Is Your Brain on Birth Control and a researcher who has spent most of her 2-decade career studying women, relationships, and health. In addition to having established an award-winning health and relationships lab at TCU, she has published nearly 100 academic articles and is a much sought-after public speaker. Her latest book is titled The Period Brain, The New Science of Why We PMS and How to Fix It. This is going to be another fascinating conversation. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Are you looking for a space that celebrates diverse perspectives, explores new frontiers, and brings all of your favorite people together? The annual Sexological Conference, hosted by Sexual Health Alliance, is where sexuality leaders gather. This conference connects you with world-class experts, leading sexuality companies, and a community of like-minded, passionate, and welcoming professionals. You'll find your people at the Sexual Health Alliance Annual Sexological Conference this October. Get your ticket to be inspired, educated, and empowered. Note that this conference is open to anyone and everyone. Head over to sexualhealthalliance.com, select the Annual Sexological Conference page, and save your spot today. For nearly 80 years, the Kinsey Institute has been the place where sex and relationships are understood. Now, you can help advance its expert-led research. This month, the Match Group is offering an incredible 2-to-1 match for all gifts to the Kinsey Institute Research Fund in recognition of its vital impact. Your donation will help fund important research on topics such as sexual well-being and aging, sexual assault prevention, shifting dating trends, and the impact of AI and technology on relationships. Donate now to help maintain the Kinsey Institute as the global hub to explore, discover, and share knowledge about sexuality, relationships, and human behavior. Be part of this crowdfunding campaign and make your gift to the Kinsey Institute Research Fund go further this October. Visit kinseyinstitute.org to participate in the Make Your Match campaign and support sex science. Okay, Sarah, let's dive further into your book, The Period Brain. Now, I have to say that I learned a lot by reading this, and one of the things that stood out to me was when you talked about how women's metabolic needs actually change at different phases of the menstrual cycle. So in other words, women's bodies actually need more calories at certain times than others. And I'd actually never heard that before, and I'm sure a lot of people listening probably haven't either. It's an interesting thing, right? Because when we hear about things like dietary guidelines, it's generally pretty one-size-fits-all advice, like 2,000 calories a day. Like that's the way that at least I've kind of always learned to think about it. But tell us about that. How is women's cyclical hormone nature ignored in a lot of the health advice that we receive? And what are the implications of that?
Yeah, and a really great question. And I think that a lot of people are surprised. I was surprised when I first learned this because most of our understandings about what it means to be a human being have been grounded in science that was created for male bodies, right? So men were studied, and the assumption was that women were just smaller men with, some lady hormones and then breasts and ovaries. And then, it's like, okay, well, we can just apply all of this information to women and just like shrink it and pink it, right? And sort of make it, suitable for the ladies in the room. Unfortunately, given the vast number of ways that our hormonal changes shift the processes in our body, this just doesn't work for us, right? Because women aren't one size fits all. We cycle, and we cycle both within the course of a menstrual cycle, but we also cycle across a lifetime where we go through a period of fertility and then we go through a period of infertility once we transition into menopause. Right. We also experience cycling with pregnancy and so on and so forth. And so women we're a little bit of a moving target. And you can't give us these one size fits all set of guidelines for what we need to be doing or what our body is supposed to do or what normal looks like, because they don't always work for us. And one of the cases in point that I talk about in the book is the fact that during the luteal phase, our body temperature increases by almost a full degree. And as a result of this, as well as the vast number of metabolic shifts that have to go on in the body, our calorie needs increase by like about 7 to 11%. Right. And so if you're somebody who's given that 2,000 calorie a day guideline that I've been given, and it sounds like you've been given too, this is like needing an additional somewhere like 120 to 200 calories a day. And this is substantial, right? So if you're somebody, and especially women, who've been made to feel like, one of the only pieces of value that they offer this world is having a nice looking body, right? When you have a woman who's being told like there's so many calories you need to eat a day, then you'll get women saying, okay, I need to only eat this number of calories a day because this is what I was told is the right thing to do. And then they're in the luteal phase and they're not eating enough. And what happens when you don't eat enough, especially during a time in your cycle when your body thinks that it's preparing for pregnancy, which is a time when it's most vulnerable to metabolic stress, what will happen is your brain is going to absolutely freak out, right? And it's going to say, I need to eat. Like, I need to eat. And then you say, no, body, you don't need to eat. We had our 2,000 calories today. And our body's like, I need to eat. And the next thing that you know, we end up having these terrible food cravings where we're totally preoccupied by food and thinking about all of these high calorie things that we want to eat. Or we end up having like a chance encounter with our son's Halloween candy, right? And we find ourselves eating Snickers bars at the bottom of the pantry, and then feeling bad about ourselves. So many women I know, and, and I count myself in this camp too, because I've certainly gone through periods of this in my own life, feel like their body is the enemy, right? Like they're like, well, here's like the set of goals that I want to do, but my body is standing in the way. And it's like, I think that our body as enemy narrative really ultimately stems in large part to the fact that we've been given these one size fits all rules for what it means to be human that have led women to feel like their body is totally out of control and that it's rebelling against all of the stuff that we're doing when we're doing everything right. But the fact is, doing everything right, like we've been following the wrong rules. And so our body is just responding to that. And I've found in my own life that learning to scrap these rules that we've been given that have been written for male bodies and like actually starting to like listen to what my body needs. And that does mean eating more in the second half of my menstrual cycle than it does in the first half. It also means sleeping more. And it means that I do less heavy, intense exercise. I tend to shift that toward the earlier phase of the cycle. I feel so much better. And I no longer feel like I'm in a war against my body. And it's also helped to sort of tap the brakes a little bit on that narrative that I think a lot of women have, which is like, oh, I don't have any self-control and I just, can't do this and I can't do that. It's all because we've been told that what we're doing, it's like we've been just given the wrong rule book. And so part of this book was just the discovery of this, right? And that like, wait a minute, no wonder we feel terrible during the second 2 weeks of the cycle. We've been given these guidelines for the way that we're supposed to be feeling, and they don't necessarily apply to us during this time.
Yeah. And, that's something that I have to say I hadn't really thought about till I read your book, is how PMS is kind of this artificially manufactured thing when you think about it, right? That you have women who are told that they're supposed to behave in certain ways and they're at war with their own bodies. And that's naturally going to exacerbate things like mood changes and, a lot of these other unpleasant things that happen that we associate with PMS. But it's because in a lot of ways, it's women who are just kind of fighting against their own bodies because they haven't been taught about what their bodies need. And if you adapted your behavior in different ways at different points of the cycle, you could probably alleviate a lot of those symptoms. So this concept of PMS, the way that we think about it, really just pathologizes a lot of normal, natural things that happens to women's bodies. And we're making the symptoms worse than they should be in a lot of cases because we're just not equipping women with the information they need.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's like PMS ends up being this like grab bag, right, of a combination of things that happen on purpose because our body is gearing up for the possibility of pregnancy. And so in the book, I kind of talk through what some of those different changes are and give language to them so that way women can understand the way that their brain and the way that the rest of their body is sort of shifting to help meet these goals. But then it's a combination of that mixed with actual pathology that has been created as a result of following the wrong rules and following guidelines that we've been told is like what we're supposed to be doing, but was just never made with a female body in mind.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask you about PMDD or premenstrual dysphoric disorder. That's different from what we call PMS, right? And most of the things that we categorize as PMS are just natural common changes that happen as women enter the luteal phase. But for about 5% or so of women, they experience these really severe physical and psychological symptoms that can be quite debilitating. So when we were talking about how PMS is kind of like this manufactured thing, we need to be careful to not dismiss the reality of women with PMDD. So tell us a little bit about PMDD. What does that look like and why does it happen?
Right. Yeah. PMDD is one of these things where it's a really heartbreaking diagnosis because essentially what happens to these women is every month when they are having a cycle, for some of them and for many of them, it's as soon as they've ovulated and they start releasing progesterone, they go into a deep depression. And so a lot of them go into a depression so deep that they even begin to question, whether they want to live anymore or they can experience extreme anxiety. It causes a lot of psychological symptoms. It tends to cause some physical symptoms as well, but it's primarily defined by just like deep life-altering and limiting psychological changes generally associated with extreme depression and extreme anxiety and anger. A lot of women also report a lot of anger. And this seems to be the result of an extreme sensitivity to these hormonal changes. My guess is, because the research is still very much in its infancy, I mean, the current wisdom is that, okay, this is a result of extreme sensitivity to hormonal changes, but we don't really understand why, right? And there are some clues. And so some of those clues are that we tend to find that women who have PMDD, the probability that they've experienced some sort of trauma or chronic stress is significantly higher than if you look at a control sample. And so there's some idea that it has something to do with the dysregulation of their stress response, because whenever you have a big hormonal change, just like any type of big change, you need to have your stress response to be able to get all the pieces put back together again. It is kind of like all the king's horses and all the king's men with Humpty Dumpty. The stress response kind of tries to put everything back together again after there's been some sort of a upheaval. And the idea here is that if you've experienced trauma or extreme stress, that this dysregulates your stress response in ways that then minimize your ability to quickly adapt to these, rapid hormonal changes that you get in the second half of the cycle. So that's one set of ideas that's out there. Another set of ideas that is out there is that it is the result of inflammatory activity again. And we do also find that women who have PMDD oftentimes also have a comorbid autoimmune disease, which, is something that can cause chronic inflammation in the body. And so there's a body of research also looking at the role that inflammatory activity, which again, when you have chronic inflammation, it does erode at cellular plasticity and the ability to quickly adjust to hormonal changes and other types of changes in the body. And so the idea here is that maybe minimizing inflammatory activity would be the way to try to minimize symptomology. there's those types of ideas about it. It's one of these things where if men suffered from this, I'm sure that it would have been solved a long time ago. And the women who experience this, I mean, because it is so debilitating, because they really do experience, and it's like for some of them, it's 2 weeks out of every cycle, right? So 2 weeks out of every 4 weeks to feel debilitating depression is heartbreaking. And like what makes it almost more cruel is that they feel pretty good the first 2 weeks of the cycle, and then they know it's coming. To keep being yanked back and forth is really hard for them. This is a different beast than just like run of the mill, kind of what most of us think of as PMS. This is like its own animal. And my guess is that we're going to find, as we sort of move through the research in coming years, that there's multiple types of PMDD, right? And I'm guessing that there's probably more than one path to arrive there, right? So it may be something that's related to chronic inflammatory activity for some women. For some women, it may be dysregulation of the stress response. Thankfully, there is some research that finds that things like cognitive behavioral therapy can be really useful to women and very palliative in terms of helping get them out of the loop. Because oftentimes what happens when women have PMDD is that they do get into these really counterproductive loops where, they're feeling really anxious and sad, and they lash out at people that they love, and then they're upset about that because then they think that they're unloved because who could possibly love them because they just responded that way, and that makes them more upset, and then they lash out, and you get into these cycles. And with cognitive behavioral therapy, it teaches you to catch yourself when you're in a cycle like that and be able to remove yourself from it. And it's been found to be very helpful for people who are looking for non-medical related interventions, like something that's not a medication. Other things that have been found, anything you can do to increase cellular plasticity, do. And I talk a lot about what some of those things are in my book. But we're doing some research right now in my lab where we're looking at vagus nerve stimulation. And I don't know if you're familiar with any of this, but the vagus nerve is that wandering nerve that travels from your nervous system throughout the rest of your body, throughout the periphery, to get information about the body and send it to the brain. And then the brain also sends information about itself to the rest of the body. And so it's this communication pathway between the brain and the rest of the body. And there's this really cool research with major depressive disorder and other types of disorders, and even endometriosis, which is overgrowth of the endometrial layer, that finds these different, very disparate things, right? Major depressive disorder on the one hand and endometriosis on the other, to be very responsive to vagus nerve stimulation. So you stimulate the vagus nerve. And the way we do it in the lab is with a little device that you put on your ear. It has the effect of stimulating the nerve, and it increases your heart rate variability, and it kind of calms your body down. It activates the sort of rest and digest part of your nervous system. And there's some good research that shows that regular stimulation decreases endometriosis, it decreases symptoms of major depressive disorder. And so we are currently running pilot work to see whether or not it might be helpful to women with PMDD as well, because there's every reason to believe that it should, given that it seems that there's at least some role of dysregulation of the nervous system involved in this extreme sensitivity to hormonal changes. And so we're hopeful that we'll find some other options that way.
So interesting. You always have a ton of studies going on looking at this from so many different angles. So we could do a whole podcast episode on each one of those studies. But so I want to go back to something that we were talking about a little bit earlier, which is the science of sex differences and how a lot of research practices have held us back from having a fuller understanding of women's brains and bodies. And one of the big issues has been this mistaken idea that male and female bodies are just kind of interchangeable, right? And so as a result, a lot of studies have only focused on men. So what's the problem with using the male body as the standard in scientific and medical research, and just assuming that, like, if you're testing a medication and you're only testing it on men, that it's going to work the same if you gave that medication to women?
Right. Well, yeah, the reason it's a problem is because it doesn't. It's just like our bodies are different. And at first, the idea that male bodies and female bodies are more or less interchangeable, I think at first that was an idea that was born just out of not really caring what happens to women, right? Like I think that originally, like when medicine first started as a field and medical research sort of started as an endeavor, that it was just really like, whatever, the women can do this too. And nobody really cared that much. And so I think there was some sexism at play. And then you move forward, 100 years. And now it's almost it was like the reverse thing, right? So like when I was growing up and, I was taught, just like a lot of women were taught, that sort of the route to female independence and the ability to be able to, stand on our own 2 feet was to argue that we're just like men, right? And that there's really no differences between a male and a female, and women can do everything that men can do, and, so on and so forth. And so I think that, there's a lot of us who had been taught that sort of the great deliverance from sexist ideals and gender roles was to just deny the existence of sex differences. And this sort of ethos, I think, really permeated science. And I think it really took it by the short and curlies, because I think science has very much been wanting to hold on to that as a narrative, is like, oh, men and women are, exactly the same. And, there's no real differences. But the result of this is actually really bad for women. And so even though this was an idea that I think in a lot of ways has been perpetuated by a desire to make things better for women, it's actually made things a whole lot worse, right? And the reason for this, one, if you look at biomedical research, it has primarily been done on men and male bodies. And what researchers find and doctors find is that when you have medications, for example, that have been tested mostly on men, and then you give them to women, our bodies don't always respond the same way. This made a big splash like a couple of years ago with Ambien, where there was women who were like sleep driving and stuff because they were given these huge doses of Ambien. And it turns out that female bodies metabolize the drug in Ambien differently than male bodies, and not just in a way that's smaller and pinker, right? It's just we have a different metabolic pathway that deals with that drug. And the result is that we need about half the dose that a man does to have the same half-life. And that's just one example of, the many ways that the male body and female body differ, is the way that we metabolize drugs. And this is why it's something like 80% of drugs get pulled off the market within the first year of release because of unanticipated side effects in women, right? And this is because women aren't being studied as women, right? We're just like, if we're included in the research at all, it's usually in small numbers, and nobody's testing for sex differences because they don't want the inconvenience of saying, okay, well, this drug works for women, but it doesn't work for men, or it works for men, but doesn't work for women, right? Because then they're going to have a more difficult time getting it approved, slower to go to market, slower to make the money that they want to make. And so medications have not necessarily served female bodies because of this idea that our bodies are interchangeable with male bodies. There's been a big stink made in the last couple of years, which I was very happy to see, about seatbelts, because seatbelts were actually designed with male bodies in mind. And it turns out that because of that, they protect male bodies better in crashes. And so now they're trying to find more sort of an equilibrium, right, in terms of how seatbelts are positioned in a way that will equally protect a male and a female body. We see this with the law. So David Buss, who I'm sure you've talked about, or at least talked about his work.
Yep, he's been on the show before.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would imagine he would be on your show because he's like the perfect guest. He wrote this really great essay talking about the reasonable person standard in the law. And the reasonable person standard assumes that the reasonable person is male. And so when you're talking about things like, for example, sexual harassment, what men and what women see as harassing is different, right? And so if you assume the reasonable person standard and the reasonable person you're considering is male, you're going to come to a very different set of conclusions than if you assume the reasonable person is female, right? And these things aren't taken into consideration in most cases, right? Within the drug companies, they don't take sex differentiation very seriously. Within the design of different types of human products, including seatbelts, it's not taken seriously. Within the law, it's not taken seriously. And it needs to be taken seriously because it's like our bodies, and it's all because of pregnancy. It's like, even if you don't want to have a baby, if you're a woman and you don't want to have a baby and you're a lesbian and you're celibate and there's like no way you'll ever have a baby, your body is still wired for it. And because of that, it's like it has to undergo this like huge number of changes in the way that it does everything to accommodate the fact that it does have to sometimes grow life. And that means that the way that our bodies do everything, ranging from our cardiovascular system and the way that it works, to the way that we metabolize drugs, to the way that our bodies even opsonize, which is like destroying bacteria Like our immune systems differ in the way that they even manage different types of threats. And these are differences that extend far beyond the obvious differences in our physical bodies. Like, right, there's like stuff on the inside that's very different from one another. And it's only very recently that people are starting to feel like, okay, like, all right, you got us, sex differences matter. Like, and they matter right down to the cell that you're studying. Like if you're only studying male cell lines and you're trying to understand, for example, how cells manage cancer threats or how cells grow in response to different types of chemical threats or different types of nutritional conditions, you can't only study male cells because female cells do things differently sometimes. And it's fascinating that we get sex differences right down to the cellular level, but we do. And the fact is that, it's like a lot of these things don't lead to overt differences like in every day-to-day life. Like, my heartbeat and your heartbeat are probably doing about the same thing. But if you try to introduce a medication that's influencing some pathway, the pathways that our bodies are arriving at that same heartbeat are probably very different. And again, just because our bodies have had to do all of these working around things because of the fact that we sometimes support two lives instead of one.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And, I think we have made some progress in recent years in terms of getting better in this area. But, with all of the recent changes in the world of science and things that are happening at the government level, I don't know how long that progress is going to last, but that's a whole other issue.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's like a whole week's worth of podcasts right there.
Yeah.
Like, good Lord.
Yeah. And, another issue with the research is that a lot of scientists just seem to think or have long thought that women are just too quote unquote complicated to include in research because they have these cyclical hormone shifts and you have to account for the fact that women are going to be in different phases of their cycles. So how do scientists typically approach this, right? With the issue of like trying to control for where women are in their phase?
This was one of the things that surprised me the most when I really got into the world of like neuroendocrinology and neuroscience. Because here, I was trained, I'm like an evolutionary psychologist. I was David Buss's, one of his graduate students. So it's like my whole world was sex differences, right? I understood the evolutionary foundations of them. It seemed very clear, you've got this male path and a female path and like what optimizes reproductive success is going to differ. And because of that, you're going to have all these other differences. And so I was always very steeped in understanding that there's sex differentiation all over the place in the body and in the brain. And then I get to neuroscience and I start reading the research, and they only include females or women in research in the first couple of days of the menstrual cycle when hormone levels are low. And they're doing this to try to minimize the impact of their hormones on any type of an outcome that they're studying. But what this means is that they're actually never studying women when they're in a hormonal state that they spend most of their lives.
Right.
And the fact is that researchers know that women's sex hormones are going to influence the outcome, or else they wouldn't need to control for it. So they're controlling for it, knowing that our sex hormones are probably going to influence what they find. But what does that mean? That means that there's a bunch of stuff that whatever their intervention is going to do to a female body that they just don't want to measure because it's too much work. And they don't want to have to figure it out, right? And this is absurd. And like even now, the NIH put forth this idea, you have to include females or women in research. And the way that a lot of researchers have dealt with this in the animal world, what they do, if you're ready for this, they include female mice and rats, but they overrectomize them.
Mm-hmm.
So now you have a female mouse or rat that has no ovaries. So it's not producing any sex hormones. And you're trying to say that this is somehow equivalent to a female that's got a cycle and hormones? No, that doesn't work. And so that's the way they've skirted it. And then in the human world, again, they just study women in the early days of the cycle when hormone levels are low. And then they'll include the women in a sample with men. And they never test for sex differentiation. And most of the studies are done where they're underpowered. They couldn't test for sex differentiation. So even if there was sex differences, they don't have enough participants to actually test for them and find out whether they differ. And this is completely absurd. There was a recent meta-analysis that was done looking at this within the fields of psychiatry and neuroscience. All right. And psychiatry is an area where there's sex differences everywhere. I mean, it's like women are diagnosed with like depression, for example, at twice the rate compared to men, right? Whereas men have like something like a 4-fold increase of having autism, right, relative to women or girls. So there's just sex differences everywhere. And that could go on and on. Like bipolar disorder is more female, schizophrenia is more male, and on and on and on. So there's sex differences everywhere. They've looked at the studies on interventions for different types of psychiatric treatments in the major journals within the field of psychiatry and neuroscience. And it's something like 80% of the studies never tested for sex differences in their treatments.
Wow.
I mean, it's just insane. That should be criminal. It's like it's so disconnected from what actually happens in the world. It's ludicrous. And so it's like when you hear it, it's like, oh my gosh, well, that doesn't make any sense. And it's like, no, it doesn't make any sense. But it's like science sometimes gets really myopic, right? Where they get so zeroed in on the idea of like, can we prove cause and effect between this and this? And so we keep everything the same and, all of this. And usually the people who lose when they're doing that is women, because they never study women as women, right? They study women as an overectomized mouse, right? Or they study women as a woman in the first 5 to 7 days of her cycle when hormone levels are low. And then the result is that we don't actually know how our bodies respond to things the other 21 days of the cycle when hormone levels are high.
Yep. So, I got to ask, how do we make science better? How do we do it in a way that better serves women and is going to give us a better understanding of their bodies and design treatments that are going to be better for women's health?
Yeah, like design treatments that like work for women. So I think, one of the things I write about in the book is that I think science needs a do-over, right? So, we hear a lot about this idea of bikini medicine, which is this assumption in the field of medicine that if you're treating a patient, that a female patient and a male patient are essentially interchangeable, except for the parts of the body that are covered by a bikini, right? And then you just have to go to the gynecologist for that stuff, ladies, right? But bikini medicine is a product of bikini science.
Yeah.
And so we need to end bikini science. And this really means like two sort of broad changes within science. And the first is assuming sex differentiation unless proven otherwise. So currently, the assumption is assume no sex differentiation unless you prove otherwise. And I think we need to reverse that. And I think that we need to start with the null hypothesis that men and women probably differ, or males and females probably differ. And you know what? If you run a study and it turns out that they don't differ, great. Then you can include men and women in the same study and go from there and save yourself, 50% of the participants that you would need to recruit. But the onus should be on the scientists to show that there is no sex differentiation before they can move on and just lump us together in a single study without testing for differentiation. So that's step one. Step two is that when you include women in research, you need to study them as women. And what this means is actually studying women in each major phase of the cycle, right? And just to make things simple, it's just like 2 times in the cycle, right? Because you could get real nitpicky and say like 4 times in the cycle and then this and then that. But even just as a starting point, twice in the cycle, once when estrogen is the primary sex hormone, once when progesterone is the primary sex hormone. Because we know that they do sort of get the body marching in different directions, these 2 hormones. And the result of this is that our body is going to probably respond to treatment somewhat differently at time 1 compared to time 2. And just to give some examples of this, women who have different types of psychological conditions, like even like ADHD, what women report to their doctors is that their medication works about half the month and it doesn't work the other half of the month, right? Like, wouldn't that be good information to have if you have ADHD and are taking medication? And wouldn't that be good information to have if you're a researcher who's studying ADHD medication and then seeing whether titrating the levels of medication, depending on cycle phase, lead to better symptom control? And is that being done right now? No. My hope is that as we sort of move forward, that we do move toward a science that's actually going to serve female bodies, which means 1, testing for sex differentiation. Because the fact is, and I love men, so like I just want to, because I always talk about like women this and women, and so like I want men. Like I've got a son and like a partner, like a male partner. The way that we study people right now, if we're messing we're throwing some women in with men, it's meaning that we can't understand anyone. Because if there's sex differentiation, it's like you don't understand men now either, right? Because their results are getting all mucked up by the females in the sample. The females' results are getting all mucked up by the male results in the sample. And it just means we're not going to understand anything about anyone. And so I think that this is like the best route forward. Assume sex differences until proven otherwise. And when you're studying women, study them as women, not as tiny pink men.
Well, I think that's great advice and recommendations, and we'll see where things go. But science, unfortunately, is one of those areas that is often slow to change.
Yeah, it takes a lot of dead bodies, as they say,
It
because
usually
ultimately
does.
you don't get major paradigm changes in science until the people who have been doing things the old way ultimately retire.
Well, I wish we could end on a more optimistic note than that. But but thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Sarah. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new book?
Yeah, so you can buy The Period Brain anywhere that books are sold. So just go to your favorite indie retailer. You can go on Amazon. You can find it any way you want to that way. And it's also available as an audiobook if you're somebody who likes to listen to audiobooks when you're out walking around like I do. You can find me online. My website is sarahehill.com, and that is Sarah with an H. And you can find me on social media at Sarah E. Hill, PhD. And I'm on all channels, but most active on Instagram.
Well, great. I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.